It's a pleasure to welcome and introduce our guests. And again, thank you both for sharing your experience, your expertise, and your insights with us. Randi McGinn is a longtime active Democrat and one of the country's leading trial attorneys. She is a highly regarded litigator within the profession and generally, and she practices both in the criminal and the civil arenas. She served as the special prosecutor in the criminal case against APD officers Sandy and Boyd for the Sandy and Perez for the 2014 killing of James Boyd in the Sandia foothills. Thomas Grover is a former Albuquerque Police Department patrolman and sergeant with extensive experience, skills, training, and knowledge in police practices, procedures, and government operations. He holds a master's in public administration, and additionally, he is a full-time lawyer whose practice focuses upon correcting government misconduct, including whistleblower actions, wrongful termination, public records violations, administrative actions, and discrimination actions. So welcome to you both, and let's begin. We would like to examine police influence over law enforcement policy from the points of view of both police officers and the public. As public employees, police are entitled to certain protections. However, much of the public is concerned about the seemingly unchecked power over life and death that police have. The public wants to know that police misconduct can be prevented and will be punished, especially in the aftermath of well-documented deaths at the hands of police nationwide and here in Albuquerque. Impacts of police misconduct fall particularly hard on communities of color and on people with mental health conditions. Albuquerque and the Albuquerque Police Department have been under a United States Department of Justice consent decree for 7 years because of APD's pattern of use of excessive force. Key accountability issues involving use of force remain unresolved, and many point to the police union as a major reason why there is no progress and even resistance to accountability. Can you please address the role the police union plays in this process? Has that benefited the public good? Why or why not? And Randi, if you would begin. Thank you.
So it's interesting being a Democrat who supports unions and then looking at the union as the source of the problems in the police department. And I think what's happened is the union is made up of people, and it's not a union problem, but it's a person problem. And so APD, we need to rethink policing completely and rethink APD policing completely, because since a guy named Hyde killed 2 police officers 12 years ago, the emphasis in APD, because there's always a cause and effect, has been on recruiting and hiring and training warriors. And police departments need not just warriors, but they need peacemakers. And probably the focus should be on recruiting more of those people, pattern something like the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, which has a whole cadre of people who are not trained armed officers, but are social workers who are sent out for most calls involving homelessness, basically social problems, homelessness, drunkenness, dispute resolution. And about 40% of the calls that now come into the police department there in Eugene these people get sent, not people with guns and uniforms to be warriors and to fight people. And it's a different skill set. And by the way, I don't think we eliminate warriors from the police department, because you need both. There are times when only a warrior will do, when you need somebody with a gun who is trained to take out a really, really bad person, that you need those people. But the truth is, blessed are the peacemakers. We need more peacemakers than we need warriors in the department. And the problem with the union is the warriors are more aggressive than the peacemakers always, right? So the people that run for the union is the warrior end of APD. And so what we need to do is switch the focus completely, and then I think you will get a union that is more interested in peacemaking and dealing with some of the problems the social problems in ways that don't involve a gun. And so you asked what the problem is. The problem is now the warriors are in charge, and their job for the union is seen as protecting the warriors. That if somebody is doing an investigation into somebody who shot somebody, they close ranks and they do everything they can to protect the person, as opposed to try to fix the problem and keep APD from shooting more people. So because those people are in charge, that's the problem. But it's a much deeper problem. It's a rethinking of the police department. And by the way, there are plenty of people in APD who are peacemakers, including at the James Boyd shooting. It is not common knowledge, but there was a crisis intervention trained officer named Michael Monet who was up there dealing with Boyd when the warrior troops arrived, the rope unit arrived to take over, and stepped in and kicked the peacemakers out. And he had a breakdown after all this happened, because out of the 136 encounters where he'd been sent up to talk somebody down, he'd always talked them down until the James Boyd shooting. And it is my belief, had they left him there, James Boyd wouldn't have been shot. So
okay, Tom, let's get your take on this.
I mean, it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually very complicated. And you have to begin with this landscape, which is unions exist to represent the interests of that bargaining unit. So within APD, you've got the police officers, the sergeants, and I believe the lieutenants are still in there, as the parties that are represented by the Albuquerque Police Officers Association. And their objectives are pretty straightforward, like any labor union, to increase the benefits and protect and represent the members' interests to have increased, better working conditions. Now, where the conflict happens is, one, you're going to have that tension between labor and, of course, management, because labor always wants more. And I come to it from a little bit of a different perspective, because my wife imported me from Boston in the mid-90s. So I have sort of a Boston, Northeast or a labor attitude, which is, if management gives labor everything, they still want more. New Mexico labor organizations are a little bit less aggressive, but that's the underlying landscape. So you've got a bargaining agent, that being the police union, that is constantly in a state of tension, in theory, with management. The police union wants to protect their members, the officers, the sergeants, the lieutenants, both in their employment, to increase their working conditions in a more favorable manner, and in theory to have a better earning potential, or ability to make a living. Where the issue comes in is where does the organization's interests run counter to the public needs, and the consent decree's objectives. And labor does what labor does, which is protect the interests of its members. We have this issue with the consent decree, or the CASA, where there's this desire to have additional, if not increased, accountability of officers that commit misconduct. And Randy and I are 100% on the same page, which is we do not want officers who commit misconduct to not face repercussions for that misconduct. I mean, as an officer, nothing makes me more sick than seeing an officer commit misconduct and get a pass, or be treated differently than someone who essentially does the same thing but does get disciplined. Nothing is more toxic than that type of disparate treatment in a law enforcement workplace. But the question is, is there mechanisms in place by which officers that commit misconduct can be held accountable? And from my perspective and my experience, there are endless avenues by which officers who commit misconduct can be held accountable. But where the breakdown happens isn't so much with what the labor unions are doing and representing the officers. It has to do with the people who are running the departments, the people who are running the cities or the counties or even the state, that fail to enforce existing mechanisms that hold people accountable. And I mean, that's half my practice, where I'm dealing with officers who have been outspoken about misconduct and nothing gets done. And the reason why nothing gets done is not because of the police unions, it's because of, higher ranking personnel or, office holders. And that's, to me, from my perspective, that's where the problems really lay.
Okay, so again, to address what both of you have said, and I'm going to oversimplify it, but Randy, more or less along the lines of the real thing that we should be targeting is creating what the city seems to be trying to create now, which are varying levels of addressing crisis situations and not sending police in, armed police, for every situation that might require a mental health intervention and so on. But what I think the public is reading about what's happening with the consent decree and so on, that the problems really seem to be grinding to a halt when it comes to disciplinary actions and to the investigation of disciplinary actions. And that's where it seems the union also is holding pretty darn tight on it. Now, there definitely are a lot of complexities, Tom, as you said, but it's not just necessarily, it seems to me, clawing up to the hierarchy in the police department, and the fault lies there. From things I've read, for example, now to address what Randy was saying, that some police reforms, like the EPIC reform that apparently Albuquerque Police Department's doing, which is Officer A looks at what Officer B is doing. If Officer B is sort of screwing up and engaging in misconduct, you step forward and you say something. From what I understand, though, that in Minneapolis, those were EPIC officers who watched Chauvin kill George Floyd. They had EPIC training, and they were EPIC officers. And is there still sort of a culture of comes from training of not only a warrior mentality, as you said, Randy, but of also being quiet, when your fellow officer does something, and what part does the union have in that, and police culture? I mean, there's a lot to break down here to talk about. So let's keep talking about. Let's try to keep focusing on, are there problems with the union? And one other thing that I have read, and then I'm going to let you guys talk, is that when collective bargaining, and there is a problem with public employee unions, but we support unions, but when collective bargaining came into place with police departments, statistics show that the use of force, and that deadly use of force, increased by 20%, 30% in some places, when it looked as though that there were protections there against disciplining police officers. So let's keep the ball rolling and talking about those things, with me being a devil's advocate.
Well, but it's because they negotiated due process. I mean, they negotiated with the city about what due process does a police officer get if he's involved in a shooting. So, for example, and so it's on the end of management agreeing to some of these things. Unlike any other person who shoots somebody in this state, if you shoot somebody, I can guarantee you, if they know you're the shooter, they're going to take you down and talk to you and interview you the very night that this happens, and they're going to separate you from the rest of the witnesses so nobody can get their story straight. What they've negotiated for through APD is there's like a 3-day delay before any of the police officers who are involved in a shooting are questioned, and they get to bring in their lawyer always, and they have 3 days to get their story straight. There's you can't talk to anybody else. They investigate themselves in a way that they would never investigate anybody else because there are problems with it. And so in the next negotiation, perhaps management should say, we're not going to agree to that. If you shoot somebody, then you have to come in and talk. Although, there is case law that says if you're forced to come in and give a statement as part of your job, they can't use that statement against you in any kind of prosecution. So there are huge problems with, and the biggest problem of all, in my view, is police investigating their own in these cases. That in the Boyd shooting, APD assigned an officer who was friends with the other officers involved in the shooting to do the investigation. And he was a good man, by the way. And he tried to do the best, but obviously he had a bias and saw everything in a way that tried to help out his buddies. And so you have to take, the first step is to take the investigative process out of the police department and have somebody outside the police department investigate police shootings.
That's part of the contract, though, right, Randy?
That's part of the contract right now.
That's part of the contract. Okay, right. Keep talking. Okay.
I'll stop and I'll let Thomas say something now. Go ahead.
You have to remember that when an officer gets involved in a shooting, that there's two investigative landscapes. You've got an administrative investigation, but taking precedence over that is a criminal investigation of that shooting. And, that officer, while, he's an employee or the deputy or whatever, they're now, in theory, a suspect for, aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, essentially, or homicide. And so as that, and they're wearing two hats because, sure, they have protections under the law where it can be justifiable homicide that provides essentially a defense for the officer not to be charged. But once that investigation, that criminal investigation gets going, I don't think we want to have the officers treated any differently than any other suspect. And having represented officers in those criminal investigations when they're getting interviewed by state police personnel or with APD, in theory, a joint task force, that, removes sort of that home field sort of landscape with the investigation. I don't think we want to deprive them of any rights that they would otherwise have. Now, APD, when they have an officer involved shooting, I agree with Randy in that there should be an outside agency doing that criminal investigation. There shouldn't be, fellow officers that people might have taken calls with or gone to the academy with or whatever. Something that's much further than arm's reach, a relationship, so that it's a true objective investigation, or at least as objective as it could be in New Mexico. But for a long time, APD wouldn't do any sort of two-step investigation. They would actually do the IA or administrative investigation while the criminal investigation is going on. And that's problematic because, when you put an officer in an IA room and you're compelling them to provide a statement as a condition of their employment, the question is that going to somehow bleed over the criminal investigation? So when you've got an officer that's subject to a criminal investigation, you've got to do the criminal investigation first. And then once that's completed, then you can move forward with the administrative investigation. And the timeline that requires the administrative investigation to be completed, within a certain set period has to be obviously stayed until that criminal investigation is done. The problem with that scenario is that you would have officers that were subject to criminal investigations, and those criminal investigations would take months and months and months. And former mayors would then catch political heat because the officer is essentially on administrative leave or administrative reassignment for, there's one officer in particular that I'm sure Rennie knows who I'm talking about, but they were at the dog pound for like 18 months. And that became, this political issue where why is this guy being paid when he's under investigation and not doing his job? And so that's where it gets complicated. So then that's what led to the department doing these contemporaneous investigations until I started making noise about that. Then they went back to this two-step process where they started leaning on the criminal investigators to be more expeditious in getting that criminal investigation done.
Still, there seems to be something glaringly wrong, though, in how this is coming out. When you look at the track record in Albuquerque, for example, in Albuquerque Police Department, where the only time, from what I understand, that a grand jury ever indicted a police officer for misconduct was the case that Randy handled. And so, we can talk about these things, these two-track investigations, but if the public wants to make sure that police misconduct gets identified and, the more serious it is, criminally prosecuted, how how do we get there? Because Albuquerque isn't doing that. And again, I think it's not happening well. And we're seeing people perceiving that there are things, and I don't want to keep harping on the contract, but we still see these deadlocked positions along the way. And be honest. I mean, the union is going to fight any change that is going to make disciplining officers a little bit more straightforward and easy. I mean, like you say, any union contracts like mad to make sure that their members have as much protections as possible.
And so it's their job. And it's their job, Terry. I mean,
sure it is. Sure it is.
Job if they aren't. And so what you need to balance the system out is a different system of investigation and prosecution. So for years, Bob Schwartz took every police shooting to the grand jury as a whitewash. And he said, and I never asked for charges. They would just go before the secret grand jury where you'd never see what evidence was submitted. And they'd come out and say, well, look, I took it to the grand jury. They say there's no crime. And he'd never asked for any charges in any of the cases. He wouldn't step up and do his job. And so what happens to balance off the unions fighting for its members, you have to have real prosecutors looking at police misconduct and doing their job in going forward on prosecutions. And again, it can't be the prosecutor who relies on the police department to make his cases. Raul Torres can't prosecute APD because he needs all the APD officers to come in and testify in all the criminal cases. It has to be somebody like the Attorney General's office who can oversee all of the investigations. I mean, I would like to see changes so that it's the AG's office that does investigations into police misconduct and police shootings and then takes them on and prosecutes the ones that need to be prosecuted. And secondly, what I did in the Boyd case was I didn't have a secret grand jury. You know, the prosecutor gets to choose, do we do this in public or do we do this in secret where I can wash this out and nobody sees that I've washed out the case? So I keep my police officers happy. And so I think they need to start doing public preliminary hearings as the initial thing to see if this should be charged, so the public knows what the conduct was and can decide whether the police officer should be charged or not. And it's all in public and not in secret anymore.
Tom?
I don't disagree with Randy. I mean, I think having fresh eyes look at each, high level encounter or each incident where there's, significant allegations of criminal conduct, never mind just misconduct, but criminal conduct, the more objective and the less, overlap there is between that given agency and the target agency, I just think makes for better justice. I mean, I don't think there's any disagreement on that. Problem is, in New Mexico, we've got 2.5 million people. Half of the population lives here in Albuquerque or in the Bernalillo County area. And we've got, one DA's office and a completely overwhelmed Attorney General's office. So, functionally, how does that work? How does that get set up when we don't have, the staffing or the resources? I mean, I think that would probably be the best practice model where you've got some unit within the AG's office that's their specific job, reviewing high-level allegations of the criminal conduct by law enforcement personnel and then taking those prosecutions forward. Whether the various members of the fraternity of district attorneys across the state will agree to it, I have no idea. But I mean, I think that's a good idea, and I say that not just to address some of the concerns that are happening in Albuquerque, but on the flip side, because I've seen really, really aggressive, almost just malicious actions taken by prosecutors in other smaller districts against officers in other agencies. So, the less sort of familiarity or, overlap, the more objective it will be.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a related but different topic because I think we'll circle back to this with questions from the audience. I can see them piling up there in chat. They would be very interesting, I'm sure. So we have had 4 police chiefs in the last 7 years. Aspects of toxic, heavy-handed police culture appear to persist regardless of who the police chief is. And, as an example would be kind of the heavy-handed approach to Black Lives Matters marches in the recent years. What's your sense of the power dynamics between the union and police department hierarchy, and whether that impacts moving forward on reform, especially reform on accountability? And that's kind of our focus, is getting accountability. Tom, let's start with you.
I think you have to remember that there's, in theory, sort of three landscapes by which an officer can be held accountable if there's misconduct. There's obviously the criminal landscape, then there's the internal administrative landscape. An officer can be disciplined by their agency. But don't forget, there's also a state certification level landscape. And I regularly deal with complaints that are brought to the State Law Enforcement Academy Board, which is the agency that provides the certification for a law enforcement officer to be a law enforcement officer. So if that gets suspended or revoked, it doesn't matter what agreements are in place between the union and management. If a given officer loses their certification or it's suspended, they're probably without a job. So there is that additional mechanism of accountability. To circle around back to your question, I including Alan Banks, who was an interim chief. APD's had 5 chiefs, and that includes the Schultz era. And from my perspective and experience, APD in particular, and New Mexico in general, is it's really like a hyper-political era of policing. So while back east, they were dealing with it in the 20s and 30s, here in New Mexico, it's very, very politicized. So police chiefs are really selected and retained or fired at the whim of administrations. And I don't think there's any dispute that what's happened with APD over the last year with the transition between Mike Geyer and Harold Medina, anybody can dispute that, politics is fully in play, that, the chief of this department, which is the largest law enforcement agency in the state, is an extension of the mayor's office, and is not independent, and is really subject to whatever agenda or objectives are being put forward by the mayor's office. So it's complicated to the extent that the union plays a role in the selection of the chief. Right now, the APOA, its leadership wasn't exactly friendly with the former chief, Mike Geyer. There was some posturing where it seemed like they seemed to have alignment with Harold Medina, but we know that relationship has gone sideways, at least publicly. So I think the unions just play with whatever administrator is going to be complementing their interests. And if that falls apart, then it's like a giant domestic relations fight.
Okay. I'm going to throw this over to Randy, but what you just said I thought was important and meaningful, that the union does and can, influence what the executive does, what the mayor does, so that if it's in their interest. So we've got a reflectivity there, and we've got a power structure there where the union, in fact, can assert, it seems to me from what you said and from what we observe, what its interests might be in the selection of a police chief. And there's a relationship there. So, Randy, yeah.
I liked Tom's domestic relations analogy, because the marriage falling apart, because in fact, Mayor Keller had a different candidate in mind from out of state who would have been terrific. And he got in here and talked to people and withdrew his name and said, "This is a mess, and I'm not coming. I'm not coming." And that's how we got Medina, because the main guy withdrew his name and said, "This is such a mess." And so the union, management and labor aren't supposed to get along, they usually. And so this is that on steroids. And so they like the chief as long as the chief is doing what they say. And then if he doesn't, or if he is perceived as not backing up some officer who shoots somebody and not immediately coming out and defending the guy, they then serve to undermine the chief. And that's why we've had such huge problems here in Albuquerque, is that they haven't worked together. And they want him to do what they want, and if he doesn't, they're out of there, and they undermine his authority among all of the other members in the force. Unfortunately, that's our domestic relations problem we have here in Albuquerque.
Okay. Anything else to say on that topic, either of you?
Mm-mm.
I would just say that with Albuquerque, APD, and APOA, it's incredibly personality driven. I mean, the participation with the union by the rank and file is not all that great. I mean, sure, there's lots of members, and the APOA has its board of directors, and I'm friends with some of them, and I communicate with them. But I mean, it is very personality driven. And one thing that I've always wanted to see is more officers engage with their union to find out what's going on, and there's very little active involvement.
Okay. Well, does that then speak for room for modifying the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, as things go forward, or not? I mean, how engaged would the rank and file be in seeing a change to the collective bargaining agreement that would allow more light shining in on accountability?
I mean, I don't know, but I mean, the other half of that equation is who's at the table. It's the mayor's office that's at the table. And, when you're dealing with a constituency like, the police union, where the mayor, whether it's this mayor or any given candidate who's mayor, they want to get that vote. So they're going to placate or try to be fairly accommodating so that there isn't that sort of tension between the two. And, when Mayor Keller took office and when he was seeking office, one of the things that he, pontificated about was how much he was going to give to the officers, how much he was going to give to, provide and improve the CBA. So, at that time, this office holder, was more than happy to give whatever the union wanted in the CBA effectively. Now things have a little bit changed. I don't know where they are with their negotiations for a new CBA, but one would think that, given the concerns you're raising, Terry, that, Keller would in theory want to draw a harder line and demand more measures that would in effect be, require accountability. But it's an election year, so he doesn't want to, alienate that constituency. So it's just a giant political football.
Okay, Randy, I see you reacting a little bit. You have anything else to add here?
Well, the job is so hard. For most, it's like any group, including the Democratic Party of New Mexico, by the way, where most people are content to just be Democrats and just float along happily and not doing a lot, and rely on the 10 or 15% of the group to do the stuff that you need to keep the party going. And the same is true of the police department. And they've got such hard jobs. And just getting up and going out every day is hard enough for some of them. And so they have sort of ceded the field to a union head who is very radically out there in protecting police officers for any kind of accountability. That's who their leader is at this point. And until they become more activated or politically activated, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So, and I also concede Tom's point of in an election year, you can't expect a lot from any of the mayoral candidates about cracking down on the police department. It's just not going to happen.
Have either of you seen any change, let's say any sort of transformative change initiatives taken by any other police unions in the country where they have taken steps to, let's say, ease up on or ease up on the disciplinary aspects of CBAs that basically a lot of critics have said provide obstructions to accountability, that provides more protections that might otherwise be called for when you're talking about a relatively straightforward employment union contract series of protections for the job holder. Does that make sense?
But I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of any. And I don't know what they're doing in Oregon, in some of the more liberal bastions, Oregon, Portland, I'm thinking of, places like that. I don't, and why would they? It's not their job. Their job is to protect their officers. So they are not going to come and say, oh, let's make it easier for you to sue officers or to investigate officers. Our job is to protect them. So it's not their role. Let
me be a devil's advocate on that, though. With the tide turning by so many in the public to being very critical of their police departments, then I would argue that the job of the union actually is to protect that goodwill as well. And part of that protecting of the goodwill is to ease up on things so that not only are your union members being, let's say, trained better as police officers to not use excessive force, but they're also trained better to be respectful, and they're also willing to ease up on some of those protections that look like accountability is not being delivered. And so a union should also be protecting the goodwill of their members. So let me posit that.
I am not aware of that. They do things. The biggest thing that's helped, I think, is the requirement of wearing cameras, which is why Manny Gonzalez is such a dangerous candidate, because he fought cameras for the sheriffs, and they had to pass a law to make them wear cameras. I mean, that's how the James Boyd prosecution came about, is because people were wearing their cameras. By the way, the one cop, the SWAT cop, was wearing his camera. The other guy was always having a malfunction every time he had some kind of thing happen, which happens a lot too. And those people then should be fired if their cameras malfunction over and over again when there's misconduct alleged. But
firing is difficult, though, right?
There are little things that have happened over the years to restore goodwill, and I think the cameras was a huge thing, but that both restored goodwill, but then showed you all the bad stuff that was really happening in the department. But I'm not aware of any. Maybe Tom knows of some union that has said, okay, let's try to get better goodwill by negotiating away our protections for our officers.
And I'm not saying protections, by the way, because there's so many critics out there that say that there's like the accountability protections and the disciplinary protections, such as the timelines that both of you alluded to, where you run out the clock on basically any kind of disciplinary measure that can be built into contracts. That there are plenty of critics out there that say that there are things in union contracts that can kind of be pulled back and allow for more accountability. So, Tom, I'm sorry to cut you off. Please go.
In the year prior to COVID, when everything got turned upside down, I was attending a conference where it was all, attorneys that practice in representing officers and our union attorneys that represent whether it's FOP lodges or individual nonprofit orgs like the APOA. And we had a breakout session where we talked exactly about these issues. And one of the big points that we had talked these other attorneys were talking about is that in their particular agency, and it was in Florida, if I recall correctly, they were trying to preempt the city to put in place an officer, video recording system, because nothing was online, and they knew that this was unavoidable. Everyone was going to end up having to wear cameras, and so they were trying to, in essence, initiate that landscape so that there wasn't any sort of surprise coming from the department, and they knew it needed to be done. It was coming. So why not get ahead of the curve and establish, those SOPs by which the officers would be wearing lapel camera video and all that. And they got rebuffed by the city, because the city said, no, we don't need to do that right now because it's too expensive. I've had other folks talk about, we want to have additional training, regarding, whether it's like in the spirit of being a guardian or peacemaker, but, along the lines of, de-escalation type training. And so a lot of times, I don't think I've seen this in New Mexico, but at least in this conference I was at, they were talking about trying to get these as benefits for the officers to get increased training and certification on these other, practice areas, if you will, and they would meet resistance from their employer. And I mean, I don't think anybody disputes the fact that officers in general are tasked with everything under the sun to deal with. And that's probably a really unfair assignment where in one moment you're dealing with a highly volatile criminal, incident. And next thing you know, you're dealing with, whether someone needs to be transported to the hospital for mental health evaluation, or you're trying to coordinate some social services. I mean, there's such a broad spectrum of responsibilities that are tasked upon officers that, I know from my own experience and from officers, they'd be happy to have that spectrum reduced so that they can do what they're best at. But to get back to your question, it has happened. It's not an entirely foreign concept where unions actually, want to get additional training, want to have other accountability measures like, on-body camera devices or whatnot, just to get ahead of the curve. Because at least from their perspective, they're in a better position to sort of dictate that terrain. And then the resistance came from the employer, not from the membership.
Okay. I'm going to see if Flora is ready to pick up some of the questions from chat, just because I'd like to get that going as well. But also a thought I want to throw out before we do that is that it has to do with the room, what room there is actually for governments to legislate in this area. Scary if you're a union person. It's scary if you're especially public, employee union person, but it has been done and it is being done. So set out parameters of what can or cannot be in a collective bargaining agreement, or even sort of coercion sorts of things from the federal government, like you are not entitled to certain law enforcement grants, Albuquerque Police Department, unless you make this change in your CBA, or you're not entitled to federal tax exemption as a union, as a nonprofit. So those are some thoughts out there. So Flora, do we have some questions from the audience?
We do. One nuts and bolts question here from Dr. Orr is, do both sides have to agree before a contract between APD and the union can be negotiated?
Typically, there's an evergreen clause whereby whatever is in place upon its expiration stays in place until a new contract is agreed upon.
Okay. And one from Felice here. Are you familiar with the findings of the Civil Rights Commission regarding APD? What concrete suggestions do you have for policy changes in the city or state to improve police practices in Albuquerque and New Mexico?
Well, I have a subversive suggestion. I think the most subversive thing that Democrats can do to change policing is to join the police department. How's that for subversive? And get people that that are peacemakers or social workers to start applying for the police department and saying, we want to change the police department from the inside out. And I want to serve my community in this particular role in a different way. And I'm not, the focus has been on hiring ex-military guys. And again, we need some of those, but that should be the smaller percentage of people who are involved in community policing. And so my concrete suggestion, if you want to change the police department, is get different kinds of people to join the force. And it starts with you, or people that who would be great on the street in problem solving, because peacekeepers are into problem solving, whereas people who come from a military background often perceive the people they're encountering as the enemy. And not a problem to be solved, but as the enemy. And that has caused all the problems in shooting. That's what happened in the James Boyd shooting, that they saw him as the enemy and not as a mentally ill guy who was a problem to be solved. I mean, you can't see it from the video, but there were 19 cops around him. That's how many there were. They could have taken, they could have talked them down. They didn't need to kill them.
Tom?
I would take the approach that when you want to create a climate that provides for police to police themselves. That is, they're going to hold themselves accountable. And so when you have a situation where Officer A, does what we want them to do, which is they're outspoken against misconduct, they take action that's, in counter to whatever culture is there that endorses misconduct or keeps it under light. And then they get injured and retaliated and fired. And then they hire someone like Randy or myself. And, the net result of that action is that it costs, the employer a fair amount of money. There needs to be consequences from that, not just a check being written, but, a chief being removed from office, a command structure that, gets the message from up above saying this is not going to be tolerated. And my experience, and I've essentially taken 3 chiefs out of some smaller departments because, they've created such a mess that the option was keep them and keep feeding Grover more business or get rid of them and try to improve the department. And in those cases, we had decent mayors who took that decision, which was, it's time for these people to go. But when you don't take those actions, then what are you doing? You're just reinforcing that there's this culture where people can be retaliated against. And, when Schultz was the chief, he certainly created that culture because he reinforced keeping things under a lid. And anybody, including myself, who was outspoken, got, retaliated against, sometimes sort of subtly, sometimes more overtly.
And that goes to Cheryl's question on how can you maintain integrity, speak out, but not destroy the relationships on the job?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? Because it's not human nature. Think about somebody in whatever organization you're in, whether it's your church or a club or, friends from school, having to report them or to confront them about misconduct. It's very difficult. It's why priest abuse went on for years and years. It's so hard to speak out against people who are your friends or people who are your group. And so it's hard to get around human nature to encourage people to do that. But the police department of all places, because their job is to enforce the law, have to be the ones that say, we're going to not just not punish people for speaking out, but we're going to reward them. And Tom, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody rewarded for being a whistleblower. It's the exact opposite. Everybody closes ranks and pushes them out, as opposed to a chief saying, I want to commend this person for bringing this to my attention and telling me about this bad activity that was going on, and we're going to give them an award, as opposed to just giving awards for valor, sort of warrior awards. That speaking up needs to be a valued thing in the organization that needs to be honored when it happens.
I would almost propose there needs to be there needs to be training within departments about how to empower officers to speak out or object to conduct that they see that's objectionable, okay? But have it in a means where their concerns are sheltered and no one's going to get in trouble initially. So it's sort of like an amnesty office where they can go out and say, you know what, I have a real problem with this officer. There were officers when I was on the job, they would show up and I would say, leave, because I knew they were reckless and I knew they wouldn't write reports. And after getting grilled by one defense attorney, I learned real quickly that it's not really cool to have an officer take some sort of actions on a call and then not write a report, because it's all going to fall on me if I'm primary. So I would say, leave, gone. I don't want you here. You're a mess. That caused some alienation while I was there. Not every officer could do that, but there needs to be some sort of mechanism by which it can be endorsed without, there being this breach in the relationship with the other officers that Randy talked about, because there is that relationship. It's not just people working with one another. There is a commodity of trust that requires. So, I may have said leave to this given officer, but 3 minutes later, that person may be in a really dangerous situation and I have to assist them. And that relationship can't be breached where they don't trust me or I don't trust them given a really bad scenario. So there needs to be some mechanism to support that, that promotes dialogue and communication as opposed to, some sort of, immediate disciplinary action.
And so what I'm hearing then, because I want to go back to the union contract issue and topic, is I'm hearing, yes, a mechanism, and everybody wants mechanism and structure so that there can be accountability and so that there can be some, that we are a civilian-run, should be, civilian oversighted agency, and so that there could be that kind of transparency. So instead of Tom saying, get out of here, and then having to deal with that person again, what we're talking about today is a mechanism that allows that person to actually be booted, and that you don't have to continually deal with that person who is a screw-up or dangerous or a malfeasor for every other officer in the force to be dealing with booting that person, yet the union contract protects that person, allows that person to stay, and makes you as a coworker having to deal with that problem. So we're talking about even higher or other mechanisms. And back, I'm a broken record. Are there problems with the union contract? So let's get to the next question. You answer it if you can, but then we'll get to the next question,
Well, again, their job is to protect their members. So what you're saying is we need a provision that allows them to fire incompetent members easier.
That's right.
That has to be negotiated from management. That can be management's position, but it's not going to be the union's position, Terry, because I don't see how the union, unless we have completely different leadership, first of all, in our union, right, that's not going to happen. But if you had an altruistic head of the union, perhaps that happens, or somebody who was a whistleblower that becomes the head of the union, that they say, look, we should all, to restore trust, we should do all this stuff. But remember, the members vote for that. And so,
right. Or can we have, elected officials, our legislators, our city councilors, and so on, can we put into place things that can modify that to some extent? Obviously, I believe that there's 4 states that do not allow any collective bargaining at all for police employees. I'm not arguing for that, and I'm throwing that out as just an example that there can be ways that we don't leave it just up to the union asserting everything that the union can get for their members, because yes, indeed, that's what their job is. That's what they do. That's what every union does for its members. And if it could capture the sky for their members, it would capture the sky for their members. I do agree that there's some viewpoint on what their mission is to the public, that they owe a duty to the public. But that will bring me, Flora, I have one more sort of like wrapping up question, but is working towards putting an end to discriminatory policing and excessive unwarranted use of force incompatible with recognizing that police perform a needed function and can earn respect when they perform their work respectfully, honorably, and well. Is that incompatible? And use that as your summary statement too, because we're getting a little close to the end of time. And give you each a minute or so to answer that.
Tom, sum up all of fixing policing in a minute. Let me hear you.
I don't even know where to begin. I mean, you have to recognize that policing as a profession is in the United States a form of government for the poor, because where I live, we don't really call the police when our trash has been dumped over or kids are scootering in the street. People in the lower impoverished areas of the city really rely on the presence of police to maintain some degree of order, because they get called for stuff all the time when they don't have resources otherwise. And I think reducing the things that police are expected to respond to will certainly reduce the number of incidences of force. The big question is, has APD scaled back its amount of unreasonable uses of force since since the filing of the CASA, and it seems to be unclear at best. And I know from people that are in IAFD, the Force Division Investigation Unit within the department, there is sort of like an administrative weight that really suppresses officers from taking any force. Whether or not it's been effective for the right reason, I have no idea, and time is yet to tell. And after 7 years, I think it's still as murky as ever before. So that's not much of an answer, but that's my comment.
Okay, thank you. Randy.
Terry, I think we need to reverse their slogan. Instead of protect and serve, it should be serve and protect. Mm-hmm. And then we need to beef up the people who are there to serve and to respond to most situations as problem solvers without guns, as opposed to warriors. And the only way to get genuine reform is to do that. You can hear my dogs barking in the background. Is to take that on, I think.
Thank you. I'll leave it up to you, Flora. Back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Terry, for moderating this discussion. Randy McGinn, thank you very much for bringing your insight and expertise to this, as well as you, Mr. Grover. We sure appreciate you enlightening us and helping us to understand this issue that is a very meaningful issue for us here in this community. Thank you all attendees for being here with us today. We appreciate your questions, your attentiveness, and we look forward to using this information going forward to better our community. We have another program coming up on Sunday. It's going to be on the New Mexico United Stadium. Please tune in. You can look at our website for information or the Blue Review for that, bernalillodems.org. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.